lecture featuring Harvard Professor of Government Stephen Levitsky. My name is Andrew Kless, Assistant Professor of History and Global Studies and the Director of Alfred University's Global Studies program. AU Global Studies is a growing interdisciplinary major-minor that seeks to cultivate a sense of global citizenship within our students by prioritizing study abroad, foreign language, and coursework ranging from art history to international business. For those interested in global studies, please feel free to contact me or visit our webpage. I'd like to thank the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the Division of Social Sciences for co-sponsoring this lecture. And I thank all of you for being here. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, one of the founders of the Global Studies program, Professor of Political Science, Jeff Slaughter-Beltrow.
Almost a founder. Bob Myers over there is a founder. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Levitsky. In our first Global Studies lecture some 16 months ago, Susie Hansen talked about how her 10 years living abroad, working as a journalist based in Istanbul, Turkey, had enabled her to see her own country in new ways. What she learned about global affairs changed not only her understanding of the United States' role in the world, but also her understanding of who she was. Similarly, in his analysis of the US political system, Steve Levitsky draws on his several decades tackling Latin American politics, including sustained periods living in Argentina, Peru, and elsewhere. An expert in troubling patterns of democratic erosion in other countries, he brings that global lens to the United States, enabling him to see patterns that others have had trouble identifying or explaining. So it's great to have him here to share his thoughts about where US democracy is today and where it's heading. I've known Steve for about 30 years since we first met at grad school. Steve and I were both Latin Americanists, so we shared similar turf in grad school. But even there, Steve made his mark as a brilliant scholar and an outstanding lecturer. He was greatly appreciated by his grad school peers as a kind, engaging, thought-provoking, and supportive colleague. Steve's scholarly work includes a long series of significant contributions. Due to time constraints, I'll just highlight three. In his first major book, Transforming Labor-Based Parties in Latin America, Argentine Peronism in Comparative Perspective, Steve provided us with a far deeper understanding of how Latin America's most famous populist party was able to perpetuate itself decades after the death of Perón, its charismatic leader. Steve's second major book, Competitive Authoritarianism, co-authored with Lucan Way, analyzed a critical new pattern of authoritarian government that had taken hold in numerous countries around the world. Political regimes that were authoritarian in nature, but that also at the same time relied on the manipulation of democratic elections in order to legitimize their rule. A leading scholar of comparative democracy, Larry Diamond, wrote of this book that it was, quote, the most important study of political regimes and regime transitions in a generation. No small praise. Steve's most recent groundbreaking work is the New York Times bestseller, How Democracies Die, co-written with Daniel Ziblatt. It's this book that directly lies behind today's lecture. And as the respected British news magazine, The Economist, put it just last month, quote, Steve's book, arguably the most important book of the Trump era is Levitsky and Ziblatt's How Democracies Die. So Steve Levitsky, scholar of populism, scholar of authoritarianism, scholar of democracy's demise, welcome to Alfred University.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here from my dining room. It's really a great pleasure to talk to you. Many thanks to the Global Studies program and Andrew for inviting me, and a special thanks to my old Berkeley friend, Jeff. It's great to see you again. So as Jeff mentioned, my co-author, Daniel, and I have spent our careers, or a good part of our careers, studying democratic breakdown and democratic crises. And the idea for How Democracies Die came basically from watching the beginnings of the 2016 US presidential campaign and realizing that even though we'd never seen some of the things we were seeing in the United States, both of us had seen it in the regions that we studied. In Daniel's case, in interwar Europe, and in my case, at various times in 20th century Latin America. And both of us had this uncanny feeling that we'd seen this movie before. And it was a movie, unfortunately, that often does not end well. Now, How Democracies Die was initially viewed as a little alarmist. Social scientists have uncovered two pretty rock solid facts about democracies. One, rich democracies never die, and two, old democracies never die. In fact, no democracy, even remotely as old or as rich as the United States, has ever broken down. UCLA political scientist Dan Treisman calculated the odds of a democratic breakdown in the United States relative to other historical cases. And he found that based on its age and its wealth, the US is 35 times less likely to suffer a democratic breakdown than Germany was in 1932, and 134 times less likely to suffer a democratic breakdown than Chile was in 1972. So statistically speaking, US democracy seemed pretty safe. But there were at least three reasons to think that we may have entered uncharted territory. First and most obvious, Americans elected a president with visibly authoritarian instincts in 2016. Turns out that matters. Second of all, levels of income inequality in the United States are higher now than at any time since before the Great Depression. The decline in particular of social mobility in the United States is so severe that Adam Jaworski, the guy who basically taught us that rich democracies never die, he's worried. He's losing sleep. Those are his words. And third, maybe most importantly, the United States has begun a transition that, to my knowledge, no democracy's ever successfully undergone. That's a transition in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses its majority status. I will return to this point. So we were alarmed enough, Daniel and I, to write a book. But it turns out we may not have been alarmist enough. Donald Trump did, of course, turn out to be a threat to our democratic institutions, but he wasn't the only one. Today, virtually the entire Republican Party is turning against democratic institutions. For 4 years, Republicans were silent as Donald Trump worked to purge, to pack, and to politicize key government agencies, from the Justice Department to the Defense Department, the FBI, to Homeland Security. They remained silent as he embraced militia groups and encouraged violent extremism, tweeting "Liberate Michigan" after armed protesters tried to storm the state capitol. Republicans protected Trump from impeachment, and crucially, a striking number of Republican politicians were complicit in Donald Trump's 2-month campaign to overturn the results of the 2020 election. What happened between November 2020 and January 2021 was an attempted presidential coup, what in Latin America we call an auto golpe. And a good chunk of the Republican Party was on board with that. With very few exceptions, Republicans refused to publicly recognize Biden's victory or to denounce the big lie of a stolen election. 17 Republican state attorney generals tried to overturn the election in the Supreme Court, and a majority of House Republicans refused to certify the election result. In his book, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, the great political scientist Juan Linz laid out some basic things that all political parties, all mainstream political parties, must do in a democracy in order to keep it. Mainstream parties, he wrote, must unambiguously commit to achieving power only by electoral means. They must commit to surrendering power unconditionally when they lose elections. They must unambiguously reject the use of violence as a means of achieving power. They must unambiguously reject the use of violent rhetoric. They must refuse the support of extremist or anti-democratic groups, and they should avoid all contact in public and in private with those groups. And they must never, ever condone violent or anti-democratic behavior carried out by the supporters or their ideological allies. According to Linz, it is critical that mainstream political parties publicly denounce, publicly oppose violent or anti-democratic extremists on their own ideological flank. And it's critical that they be willing to join forces with ideologically distant rivals, the guys on the other side of the aisle, in order to defend democracy against extremists. The Republican Party no longer meets those criteria. Outside of a handful of figures, people like Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, and Mitt Romney, the US Republican Party no longer does these things. Extremists now control state Republican parties from Arizona to Pennsylvania to Oregon. Extremists, including people who have openly endorsed political violence, are being elected to Congress. And crucially, Republican leaders are no longer willing to break with these figures. Even after the storming of the Capitol, there is no prospect of Republican leaders joining forces with Democrats to isolate Trumpism. In fact, Republicans who tried to do just that are now being censored and in some cases run out of the party. Republicans sought to remove election officials who refused to steal the election in Michigan and Georgia, but they will not break with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who endorsed the idea of executing the Speaker of the House. In fact, Taylor Greene now has a higher approval rating among Republicans than does Liz Cheney. All right, so how the hell did we get here? Why wasn't our Constitution designed to protect us from these sorts of things? Why did this happen? Well, first of all, constitutions by themselves are never enough to protect a democracy. Constitutions, even the best designed constitutions, do not function automatically. They've got to be reinforced by strong democratic norms, unwritten rules. And our book focuses on two such norms. One of them is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of one's partisan opponent. That means that no matter how much we may disagree with our rivals, no matter how much we may dislike our rivals, we recognize both in public and in private that they are loyal citizens who love the country as much as we do and who have an equal and legitimate right to be out there doing politics, to be competing against us, and if they win an election, the right to govern us. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. Second norm, a little more complicated, is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of deliberate self-restraint and underutilization of power. We don't often think about forbearance in politics, but it is absolutely vital. As we've learned over the last 4 years, the president can legally pardon whomever she wants, whenever she wants. Any president with a congressional majority can pack the Supreme Court. The Constitution does not necessarily prohibit the president from ignoring mechanisms of congressional oversight or bypassing Congress and making policy through executive orders or by declaring a national emergency. We've also learned in recent years that Congress can legally shut down the government by refusing to fund it. The Senate can prevent the president from filling Supreme Court vacancies, effectively stealing Supreme Court seats. And we've learned that state legislatures can send their own slates of electors to the Electoral College, contravening the popular vote in their state. In other words, politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution in ways that totally eviscerate its spirit. Court packing, the theft of Supreme Court seats, partisan impeachment, government shutdowns, state legislatures overturning the popular vote. Legal scholar Mark Tushnick calls this behavior, calls using the letter of the law to deliberately subvert the spirit of the law. He calls it constitutional hardball. You look at any failing or failed democracy around the world, and you will find an abundance of exactly this, constitutional hardball, whether it's Spain and Germany in the early 1930s, Chile in the 1970s, contemporary Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, Turkey. What prevents a democracy from descending into a destructive spiral of constitutional hardball is this thing we call forbearance. It's a shared commitment by politicians to institutional restraint, to not using the letter of the law to subvert its spirit. A couple of examples. Think about presidential term limits in the United States. Prior to 1951, the US Constitution placed no limits on presidential reelection. Legally, American leaders could be president for life, just like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. But for nearly 150 years, following a precedent set by George Washington, no president sought a third term. It was not the Constitution that prevented ambitious presidents like Jefferson, Jackson, Grant from seeking a third term. It was a norm of forbearance. Another example, take the Senate filibuster. Filibuster is a powerful tool. It allows a minority of senators to block the majority. That's a big deal. But for most of the 20th century, the filibuster was rarely used. The Senate recorded an average of one filibuster per year between 1917 and 1960. Senators exercised forbearance. These two norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, serve as what Daniel and I call the soft guardrails of democracy. They help to prevent normal, healthy political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracy in Europe in the 1920s and 30s and in parts of South America in the 1960s and 70s. Now, America's soft guardrails used to be pretty strong. For most of the 20th century, Democrats and Republicans accepted one another as legitimate rivals and avoided systematically destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. Prior to the 1990s, there were no impeachments, no court packing, no costly government shutdown. Filibusters were rare. Supreme Court nominees were approved even when the opposition party controlled the Senate. So for most of the 20th century, US checks and balances worked. Our constitutional system of checks and balances worked pretty well. But the system worked because it was reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. Those norms, it's pretty clear now, have pretty thoroughly unraveled. There were signs of this unraveling going back to the 1990s with the Gingrich-led government shutdowns, the partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton. But norm erosion really accelerated in the early part of the 21st century. During the Obama presidency, for example, Republican leaders began publicly and privately to deny the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. They told their followers that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans, and maybe President Obama wasn't even an American citizen. When mutual toleration disappears, politicians start to abandon forbearance. When we start to view our partisan rivals as enemies, when we start to view our partisan rivals as an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to stop them. And that is exactly what's happened in American politics over the last decade. After 2010, the Republican Congress basically treated the Obama administration as an existential threat that had to be defeated at any cost. So it played hardball. There were more filibusters during President Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and Reagan's second term combined. Congress twice shut down the government under Obama, once bringing the country to the brink of default. President Obama responded with constitutional hardball of his own when Congress refused to pass immigration reform or climate change legislation. Obama circumvented Congress and made policy via executive order. That action was technically legal, but it clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. But the most stunning act of constitutional hardball during the Obama period was clearly the Senate decision in 2016 not to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by Justice Scalia's death. That move was unprecedented since 1866. Now, of course, the Trump administration took constitutional hardball to a new level. Trump subverted congressional authority by declaring a fabricated national emergency to fund his border wall after Congress had blocked it. He defied congressional oversight by refusing to cooperate with an impeachment investigation, refusing to comply with subpoenas, and he used every possible rule in the book to try to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Think about this. This is important. The Trump campaign and its allies spent 2 months exploring a variety of different strategies that could be used legally to overturn the election result. Having state or local officials throw out ballots from your opponent's stronghold based on minor technicality. Asking the courts to do the same thing, throwing out ballots in your opponent's strongholds based on technicality. Having state legislatures set aside the popular vote and send slates of pro-Trump electors to the Electoral College under the pretense of fraud. All these actions are potentially legal under the Constitution, and yet they are profoundly anti-democratic, and they could enable the outright theft of an election. That did not happen, obviously, in 2020, but hardball election tactics This sort of tactic is now on the table. We cannot unlearn them. So I guarantee you, somebody is going to reach for these tools again in 2024. All right, so why is all of this happening? Why this collapse of democratic norms and descent into constitutional hardball? What's driving all of this is polarization. Republicans and Democrats have come to fear and loathe one another. According to a 2018 Pew survey, 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. More recent survey, I think from 2019, found that 60% of both Democrats and Republicans believe the other party is a danger to the United States. We have not seen this level of partisan hatred since Reconstruction. And this is not just traditional liberal conservative polarization. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They're about racial and cultural identity. Our partisan identities have changed dramatically over the last 50 years. Back in the 1960s, 1970s, the Republican and Democratic parties had different platforms, they differed on a bunch of things, but they were culturally and demographically very similar. Well, first and foremost, they were both overwhelmingly white and Christian. Three changes have occurred over the last 50 years. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, while African Americans, in many cases newly enfranchised, moved into the Democratic Party. Second, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration, first from Latin America, then from Asia. Most of those immigrants and their kids ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, since Reagan, evangelical Christians have flocked to the Republican Party. Go back to the 1970s, the late 1970s, evangelicals were evenly distributed between the two parties. In fact, they were slightly more Democratic than Republican. But since the early 80s, they've overwhelmingly flocked into the Republican Party. So today, Democrats and Republicans represent very different communities. Democrats are sort of a weird rainbow coalition of urban educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. And the Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. So Democrats and Republicans are separated by a set of deep and overlapping cleavages. They look different, they speak different languages, they live in different places, they attend different schools, they worship different gods, and they've got fundamentally different conceptions of what it means to be an American. That's polarization. Problem is that extreme polarization can kill democracy. When we come to view a victory by our rivals, by our partisan rivals, as something that's catastrophic, as something that's intolerable, we start to justify using extraordinary means to prevent that from happening. Things like voter suppression, election fraud, even violence. That's precisely what wrecked democracy in Germany and Spain in the 1930s, in Chile in the 1970s. The difference in the United States case, though, is that polarization is asymmetric. Only the Republicans have evolved into an extremist and anti-system party. Why is that? The answer, we think, lies in the nature of the Republican base. White Christians are not just any group. Not only were they once an overwhelming majority of the US electorate, but not that long ago, my childhood, white Christians occupied the top rung of all of this country's social, economic, cultural, political hierarchy. They filled the presidency, they filled the Congress, the Supreme Court, all the governor's mansions. They were the CEOs, they were the newscasters, they were the college professors, they were the pillars of local communities. Now, those days are long gone, but losing a majority, more importantly, losing one's dominant social status can be profoundly threatening. Many Republican voters, not all, but many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that, for many, feels like an existential threat. This is an important point because I think it lies at the heart of what threatens our democracy. Democracy requires that political parties know how to lose. That means when we lose an election, and we all lose elections in democracy, we accept defeat, we go home, we get drunk, we regroup, we get up the next day to play again. But for parties to lose graciously, that's the norm that I've just described, drunk or not drunk. For parties to lose graciously, Two conditions have to hold. First of all, parties have to believe that they stand a chance of winning again in the future. And secondly, parties have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. When politicians or activists fear that they won't be able to win future elections, or if they believe that defeat will bring catastrophe, the stakes rise. The stakes rise dramatically. Politicians' time horizons narrow. They throw tomorrow to the wind and they try to win at any cost today. In other words, desperation, fear and desperation lead politicians to play dirty. Daniel found this dynamic in his research on 19th century German conservatives. German conservatives were terrified at the prospect of expanding the suffrage. For them, giving workers the right to vote meant not only conservatives' electoral demise, but the demise of the entire aristocratic order. So German conservatives played dirty. They used fraud and repression to cling to power all the way until World War I. Somewhat closer to home, another example, Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction in the 15th Amendment brought widespread Black enfranchisement in the US South. African Americans constituted either an outright majority or a near majority of voters in most Southern states. So their enfranchisement, the enfranchisement of African Americans, scared the bejesus out of Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did Black suffrage threaten the Southern Democrats' electoral dominance, but it threatened to overturn the entire racial order. Facing what they perceived to be an existential threat, the Democrats played dirty. Between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws that allowed for the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, property and residency requirements to effectively eliminate African Americans' right to vote. Black turnout in the US South declined from 61% in 1880 to just 2% in 1912. Unwilling to lose, Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the citizens in their population, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarian rule in the South. We fear that something similar is happening to the Republicans today. Republicans' future electoral prospects, as things stand, are pretty bleak. They are an overwhelmingly white Christian party, but white Christians are a declining share of the US electorate. 1992, the year I started graduate school, white Christians were 3/4 of the US electorate. By 2012, Obama's reelection, they were down to 57% of the US electorate. By the next presidential election, 2024, they're expected to be less than 50% of the US electorate. To make matters worse, young people are overwhelmingly Democratic. Young voters, particularly between the ages of 18 and 29. But the problem isn't just that the Republican Party faces a potentially a bleak electoral future. It's that their base, particularly their activist base, has come to view defeat as catastrophic. Again, many Republicans fear they're on the brink, not just of losing elections, but of losing their country. The very idea of a white Christian America seems to be slipping away. That sense of loss is pushing many rank and file Republicans towards extremism. A recent poll sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, I think in January, just this year, found that 56% of Republicans agree with the statement that, and I quote, the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. 56%. So like the old Southern Democrats, Republicans have begun to play dirty. Since 2010, Republican governments in state after state after state have taken steps to make it harder for younger, lower income and minority voters to register and to vote, closing polling stations in predominantly African American neighborhoods, purging voter rolls, making it harder to register, making it easier to throw out ballots. This is not some new invention. The Democrats used to do exactly the same thing during Jim Crow. Now, radical Republicanization accelerated under Trump. It's gone into overdrive since the 2020 election. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, there have already been more than 100 bills introduced this year in states like Georgia, Arizona, Texas, Missouri, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, aimed at making it harder to register or to vote, aimed at making it easier for election officials to throw out ballots, and aimed in a couple of cases at making it easier for state legislatures to overturn election results. So where are we headed? First of all, it's very important to say that the opposition's defeat of Donald Trump in the 2020 election was extremely important. Anytime you remove an autocrat from power, it is a really big deal. 4 more years of Trump would have done extraordinary damage to our democratic institutions. But we are not in the clear. The underlying polarization that caused this whole mess, the polarization that gave us Trump, continues unabated. In fact, it seems to be getting worse. I see 2 future scenarios, not mutually exclusive, that I think are deeply problematic for democracy. Two places we seem to be going in the next years. One is a slide into dysfunction. Again, our system, our constitutional system of checks and balances only works when it's reinforced by strong democratic norms. So when forbearance and mutual toleration disappear, divided government, which we don't have now, but we may have soon, descends into a kind of permanent institutional warfare. Politicians turn institutions into partisan weapons, exploiting whatever legal authority they have to thwart their rivals. Take, for example, the Supreme Court nomination process. The Senate's refusal in 2016 to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by Justice Scalia's death effectively broke our judicial nomination, or at least our Supreme Court nomination process. 2 years ago, a moderate, very moderate US Senator told me that he thinks we will never again see a successful Supreme Court nomination when the president's party does not control the Senate. In other words, what happened in 2016 in Merrick Garland is about to become the rule rather than the exception. Or take impeachment. Donald Trump is exactly the kind of leader that impeachment was designed to protect us against. He's precisely the sort of demagogue that Hamilton and other founding leaders worried about explicitly in the Federalist Papers. But our politics are so polarized that for Senate Republicans, beating the Democrats or avoiding attacks from the extreme right was more important than checking executive abuse in 2019 and again in 2021. In other words, polarization has rendered the institution of impeachment completely worthless, dysfunctional. This is a dangerous and debilitating level of dysfunction. We are sliding into a world of more or less constant constitutional crisis, a world of government shutdowns, of partisan impeachments, of court packing, stolen Supreme Court seats, fabricated national emergencies, and crisis-ridden elections. That slide into dysfunction has important consequences. In the best of cases, it prevents us from dealing with some of the most important problems facing our society, from pandemic to climate change. But secondly, more importantly for democracy, dysfunction is eroding public confidence in our democratic system. When governments consistently fail to respond to citizens' most pressing problems, citizens eventually lose faith in the system, whether it's in Argentina, in Peru, or in the United States. According to a recent study about a year ago, the percentage of Americans who say they are dissatisfied with our democracy has risen from less than 25% in 2000 to 55% last year. When societies lose confidence that democracy can resolve their problems, they grow vulnerable to the appeals of demagogues who promise to get things done by other means. The other imminent threat that we face is a slide into minority rule. As you all know, the US electoral system favors sparsely populated territory. The Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated states. Most state legislatures are pretty heavily biased towards sparsely populated areas. The US Senate is heavily biased towards sparsely populated states. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees, the Supreme Court is also somewhat biased towards sparsely populated states. Now, for most of our history, this bias had no partisan effect. It was always good for Vermont. It always sucked for New York. But it never had a partisan effect because both major parties had urban wings and rural wings. It's only in the early 21st century that our parties have split markedly along urban-rural lines. Today, the Democrats are overwhelmingly based in the major metropolitan areas. The Republicans are overwhelmingly based in small towns and rural areas. That means that the Republicans, through no fault of their own, have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, in state legislatures, in the Senate, in the Supreme Court. The result has been a descent into minority rule. The Republicans have won the popular vote for president one time in the last 20 years, and yet they've controlled the presidency for 12 of the last 20 years. An electoral majority was not enough for the Democrats to win this year. Biden had to win by 4.5 percentage points to capture the presidency. If he'd won the popular vote by 4 points, Donald Trump would be president today. The Senate is even more skewed. According to one calculation, the Democrats have to consistently win 54% of the national popular vote to assure themselves the control of the legislature, the House and the Senate. Minority rule has also skewed the composition of the Supreme Court. In 2017, Neil Gorsuch was the first Supreme Court justice in the history of the Republic to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then be confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. 2018, Brett Kavanaugh became the second Supreme Court justice in the history of the Republic to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then be confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. In 2020, Amy Coney Barrett became the third Supreme Court justice in the history of the United States of America to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then be confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. This is minority rule. I can think of no other way to describe it. So what can be done? For one, principally, the Republican Party has to change. As long as the Republicans remain an overwhelmingly white Christian party in a society as diverse as ours in the 21st century, they will be prone to the kind of polarizing white nationalist extremism that currently threatens our democracy. When will the Republicans change? They will change when they lose. Political parties change when their strategies fail, when they lose elections. But there's a hitch. Counter-majoritarian institutions give the Republicans an electoral crutch. The rural bias of the Electoral College, the Senate, Supreme Court allow the Republican Party to hold on to power without having to win national majorities. They can hold on to power with about 47, 48% of the national vote. That electoral crutch has weakened the Republicans' incentive to adapt. So I think small d Democrats, not just the Democratic Party, need to double down on democracy. The best way to combat minority rule is to expand the right to vote. That means measures that make it easier for people to register and to vote. Automatic registration, easier access to polling places, prohibit flawed purges of the voting roll, fully restore the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Democrats should probably, I don't love this measure, but Democrats should probably also push to balance off the Senate by offering statehood to DC and to Puerto Rico. And although it's going to be hard as hell, we have got to get rid of the Electoral College. Americans have not collectively lost our minds. Polls show that a solid and consistent majority of Americans supports the key pillars of multiracial democracy. But it's a silent, or in fact silenced, majority because our electoral institutions are keeping it out of power. They are protecting 43% of the population at the expense of 52%. 5% don't give a shit. So it's time, it is time for us, time for the United States to do something that every other established Western democracy has done, and that is reform our 18th century institution. Amanda Gorman, my former student, put it best in her presidential inaugural poem last month. She said, "American democracy isn't broken, it is simply unfinished." I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. We have about a half hour, well, at least 25 minutes to ask questions. Anyone with questions, and we're taking them either by chat or you can directly ask Steve questions by audio. You can unmute yourselves, and if you check on the reactions button and check on the raise hand function, you'll also pop up to the top of the screen automatically. But anybody who wants to ask questions, please go either way, through the chat or asking questions directly. While we give a second for that to happen, maybe I'll ask Steve a question. I mean, when you turn to solutions, you describe a situation that sounds very dire, and I think it is pretty dire, of polarization. It's really severe polarization taking hold. And yet, to respond to polarization through political reforms, to me, I'm not sure how well that can work. And I'd wonder, one of the things feeding into polarization is this digital media landscape of ours, right? Where, social media, filter bubbles and all that thing, where it's really changed the nature of political communication in the country, fed into this politics of rage and anger and so forth. So I was wondering if you could comment on the media landscape and,
Yeah.
how that affects everything.
So the institutional reforms that we're proposing are a big ask. They're tough, but they're not nearly as tough as rolling back social media. And social media is here to stay. There are all sorts of regulations that can and should be contemplated, but we're going to be dealing with social media for the time coming. My sense is the following: there's no question, and there's been a fair amount of social science research in the last 5-6 years showing exactly what you said, Jeff, that exposure to social media does have a polarizing effect. It has a radicalizing effect. It has an echo chamber effect. It tends to move us towards the more extreme positions of our friendship network. So that's real. There's no question that it has exacerbated polarization. I guess two caveats, and they're not very interesting caveats, but two caveats nevertheless. First of all, it's important to remember that social media doesn't cause our polarization; it exacerbates it. Societies can polarize and wreck democracies without. You guys may not know this, without Twitter. So Spain descended into civil war without Facebook. Chile's democracy broke down without YouTube or Twitter. The United States descended into civil war without social media. So I think, although it seems to be very much empirically true that social media exacerbates polarization, we need to keep our eye on the fact that it's not the fundamental cause. It's not the fundamental driver of our polarization. Secondly, and this is maybe naive, and it's certainly based not on much knowledge, but we tend to run behind technological change, and we tend to initially fear the consequences, the political consequences of technological change. When radio first emerged, we thought it was going to bring fascism. When television first emerged, we figured that we worried that it would bring populism and demagoguery. Maybe it has, but societies, states, politicians, citizens eventually adapted and learned how to live with these new technologies. And I may be naive, but my suspicion is that we'll learn how to live with social media as well. The Europeans are far out ahead of us, ahead of the United States in terms of thinking about regulating social media. I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that we'll eventually catch up to social media as well.
Glad to hear that optimistic voice. We have several questions in the queue. Starting, Gary Ostrower asks, Gary Ostrower, historian here at AU, asks, is what you're saying that the Republicans are basically the greatest threat to American democracy?
Yes.
The Republican Party.
Yes, the Republican Party has evolved, and it is one of the few cases in the modern West that I could think of a mainstream, institutionalized, established political party that has evolved into an extremist and anti-democratic political party. I'm tempted to call it anti-system. I don't think it quite meets those criteria, but it's evolved into a party that is no longer fully committed to democratic rules of the game, a party that violates the series of criteria that Juan Lin's who spent his life studying how democracies die, listed as basic behavioral criteria for mainstream parties. So my answer is yes.
Gary, you want to follow up?
Yeah, not so much to follow up that line per se, but rather to ask, we created a system in this country way back in 1787 that was explicitly designed to prevent the arrival of a Donald Trump. You read, Federalist Paper #1, Alexander Hamilton warns against demagogues becoming tyrants. And it wasn't simply that you had an electoral college that presumably would prevent a Donald Trump, but you had a Senate, which, by the way, at that time was not popularly elected, and so forth. So, in other words, what we've done is we've created a situation that is, in some ways, exactly the opposite of what the founders, and they were not Democrats with a small d, but exactly the opposite of what they had intended. Can you explain a little bit as to historically how that happens?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm going to give you a very superficial account of some very muddled thinking. Two answers, a very concrete answer and a much fuzzier answer. The very concrete answer is that presidential primaries, internal party democracy, open the window to demagogues. As for everything that you want to say about basically the convention system of this, basically the smoke-filled room system of selecting presidential candidates that existed in the United States prior to 1972. It was not transparent. It was not democratic. It was exclusionary. It had a lot of limitations. It had a perfect record in keeping demagogues out because candidates were selected by their peers. These guys had worked with, knew all the possible candidates. They knew their strengths, they knew their weaknesses. They didn't always choose great candidates, but they systematically kept demagogues out. The primary system opens up the possibility of political outsiders gaining the nomination. That's what occurred with Trump. I still like primaries, but they're double-edged in that sense. But that's part of a broader trend that I want to sketch out very, very quickly, which is that political establishments, which I will define as the set of organizations and actors that possess resources politicians need to get elected. So think about three in particular: political parties, which control nominations; interest groups, big labor, big business that control resources; and the media, which allows you to reach voters. Political establishments have weakened dramatically over the last 50 or 60 years. You go back to the mid-20th century, everywhere in the world, and political establishments had a virtual monopoly over the resources politicians needed to get elected. If you were not on good terms, obviously, with the party leadership, you couldn't get the nomination. If you were not on good terms with Walter Cronkite or the mainstream media, you were not going to get media coverage. You certainly weren't going to get positive media coverage. And obviously, if you weren't on good terms with a relatively small number of donors, either big business, big labor, you were not going to get the funds that you needed to run. And that was sufficient to keep outsiders out in most countries in the world. It was not very democratic, but it was effective at keeping demagogues out, at doing Hamilton's work. The last 50 years, in part because of internal democratization, but in large part because of the role of social media technologies, political establishments, for better or worse, have lost that monopoly. It's created a much more democratic world. It's created a world where Bernie Sanders can raise as much money as Hillary Clinton. It's created a world where almost anybody can get elected president of Peru and maybe Brazil and maybe the United States. It's a much more democratic world. But political establishments, again, better and worse, have lost their gatekeeping role. And I'm not sure that's a genie that we can put back.
Steve, another question from Vicky Westacott, who directs our writing center here. She asks, do you think that the Democrats should get rid of the filibuster?
Yes, absolutely. The filibuster was, first of all, it's not some grand design by our founders that's critical to liberal democracy. Other democracies either don't have or don't regularly use a filibuster. It is a very anti-majoritarian or counter-majoritarian institution. It is not an essential feature of liberal democracy. Go back and learn how it was basically created by accident by Aaron Burr. Secondly, the filibuster was okay when it was used with great restraint, when it was used one time a year. Unfortunately, it was actually used for horrendous ends. It was usually used by segregationists to block civil rights legislation. Leaving that important issue aside, it was rarely used. When it was rarely used, it didn't have that much of an effect. But now the filibuster is gotten to a point where it's used at every piece of legislation. It has become a systematic tool of obstruction. And it's a major obstacle to majority rule. So yes, I think it should be gotten rid of.
Thank you. Bob Myers, an anthropologist here at AU, asks, is there any other country in the world that limits voting as much as we do here in the United States? Makes it as hard to vote as we do. As difficult to vote.
There are other countries. I don't think there are. I cannot think of any established democracies that make it as difficult to vote. In my part of the world, in Latin America, in many countries, it is mandatory to vote. You pay a fine if you don't vote, and that brings voter turnout to often around 80%, if not more. I'm not familiar with all Western European democracies, but I do not know of any cases where in many cases registration is automatic or it's super easy. In many cases, voting is very easy. It's often on a Sunday or a holiday. And so I cannot think, I could be wrong because I'm not familiar with every democracy on earth, but I cannot think of an established democracy that puts as many obstacles up as the United States. And unfortunately, we just have a long tradition of it. The right to vote was not even established in the Constitution in the 18th century. It really only took hold in most states in the early part of the 19th century. And we've spent the better part of 2 centuries going back and forth with efforts to restrict the vote. There's a long tradition of restricting the vote in the US.
Yeah, I apologize to Bob Myers because he actually asked specifically with regard to Western democracy. And I do teach European politics, and I would agree with you that there's no country in Europe that comes close to restricting. It's much easier to vote for all sorts of reasons in Europe than here. And there is some compulsory voting as well. Yeah, so the next question, Willow Damar asks, and I apologize for the pronunciation of the name. Willow asks, she said, there's this belief among certain sectors of the Republican Party in a deep state and the threat, the QAnon conspiracy and so forth. And asks, how do we interact with such people?
Whew, that is a key question. That is the question. If I had the answer to that question, I would have a much better paying job. There are a lot of people. I don't know if they're having any success. There are a lot of people both in academia and in NGOs and civil society that are thinking hard about that question. That are thinking about deliberative democracy and different ways of either bringing people together or establishing a kind of dialogue that can foster a minimum of trust across people. The problem is that our cleavages are all overlapping. So we live in different communities. we have different tastes. We go to different restaurants. We shop in different supermarkets. Not just Democrats. It wasn't that long ago that Democrats and Republicans were basically alike in almost everything except maybe their view of foreign policy and the minimum wage. They played softball together. They went to church together. They lived in the same neighborhood. They went to the same church. That just doesn't. It happens in some places. For the most part, it doesn't happen anymore. We are, unfortunately, surrounded in our entire lifestyle by fellow partisans, which means that most of us, not all of us, and I'm an extreme case in Boston and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but in many parts of the United States, we just don't interact very often with people of another party. And those of you who do, God bless you, more power to you. But we're all sort of out of practice at being able to dialogue with people from other parties, which is insane. And so it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge. And Democrats have to learn, obviously, they need to learn how to reach QAnon supporters, and Republicans need to learn how to reach progressives. And I throw up my hands. I don't, it's not something I've done any research on. It's a big challenge. Let me just say that.
I'm near a breakthrough on this, Steve. By next week, I expect to have the answer. I'll let you know.
Okay, just I may be able to get you a high-paying job, Jeff.
Vicki Westcott, another question from Vicki. She asked, do you think at all likely that the importance of money in US politics could become a problem for the anti-democratic Republicans? For example, if most of the very rich come to favor pro-democracy politicians.
Yeah, it's a really interesting problem. I mean, that, money in politics is another huge problem in American democracy. It's gotten so extreme that some very mainstream political scientists, even before the Trump era, declared that that the United States really could not, in good conscience, be called a democracy anymore. It was an oligarchy. The power of money had gotten so extreme that our elected leaders, our legislators, were just not responding to voters at all. They were responding to donors. So that's a huge problem, really quite apart from the polarization we're talking about. I think that paradoxically, this is Vicki's question.
Yes.
There may be something to what you are saying. If we're thinking about ways to nudge the Republican Party back into sanity and away from this anti-system position, political scientists from Cambridge scolding ain't going to do it. I can tell you that. Me writing another book is not going to do it. But donors pulling funding could have an impact. And I think that the initial response to January 6th, I think the sort of the moderation of Mitch McConnell was in part due to the message he was getting from donors. I don't know whether donors will actually follow through on pledges not to support any of the Republican politicians who didn't vote to certify the election. But that sort of pressure, yeah. I mean, our party system is changing, and the Democrats, for better and worse, are becoming a cosmopolitan party, which means they're a party of urban secular folks, of ethnic minorities, and of a growing number of wealthy, well-off, former suburban Republicans. A lot of the money is moving into the Democratic Party, and the Republicans are becoming an increasingly populist party, which is going to eventually. I mean, they have a handful of billionaires who are happy to fund them, and no shortage of, small-scale millionaires who are happy to fund them. But big money may well abandon the Republican Party, begin to, and that may be more of a corrective than anything else. I'm speculating, but I think there's something to that.
I suspected that Vicki was actually someone else because she spelled favor, F-A-V-O-U-R. It's just been confirmed in the chat that was actually her husband, Emrys, partner Emrys, who's British. So
apologies.
And a philosopher, professor of philosophy. Yeah, we have a question from Nick Schlegel. Does a professor of media and film here at AU asked, does classical antiquity hold foresight or predictive markers that lawmakers may draw from? What can we learn from classical antiquity? That's a good.
Nick, I saw this question in the chat, and I apologize. I'm just gonna punt. My ignorance of classical antiquity is so complete that any answer I gave you would just be wrong. I mean, I tend to be, so look, obviously there's a ton of insight to be taken from classical thinkers. I tend to be skeptical of these arguments that say, democracies, republics, they inevitably die. We learn from antiquity that democracy is not forever. It's I worry a little bit about sweeping generalizations from antiquity, which is not to say though that we can't learn from the some of the brilliant thinkers from that era. I'm just so woefully, embarrassingly ignorant of that literature that I'm not going to comment any further. Apologies.
All right.
And the point about democracy being based, yes, it's based in, yes, it has origins in Greece and Rome, but modern democracy is so different from those democracies that modern democracy was this establishment based. It is a very elitist democracy. It's essentially a system of constrained 20th century modern Western democracy is a system of constrained elite competition in a context of pretty broad civil liberties. And when political establishments were strong, that's all it was. And that's really quite a distance from the kind of democracies that we think about in the old days.
We're a bit past 6:30. Can you stay for a few more minutes? We still have a couple of questions that I'd love to get to. If you
Sure, as long as it's not about ancient Greece.
Right. We'll stay away from those ancient Greek questions.
Thank you.
Mark Klingensmith asks, could you give us your 1, 2, 3 list of the most important issues for each of us to focus on or organize around?
Sure. I would start with voting rights. I think voting rights are the key issue of the day. We've got to get the first and I think most direct way to struggle against minority rule or to stop minority rule is to expand access to the ballot box. It's not as simple a project as Democrats initially thought, because it turned out that Trump was able to mobilize votes just as well as the Democrats. But at the end of the day, we are much better off with a society where 80% of the electorate is voting than one in which 50% of the electorate is voting. And certainly we need to prevent this sort of neo-Jim Crow efforts to systematically discourage or deny access to the ballot box to certain parts of our society. And that's the effort. So voting rights, I think, are number one. I think we face this real danger of minority rule, and we have a set of mostly 18th century institutions that in this country we treat as sacred because we treat the Constitution and the founders as near biblical. But every other Western democracy on earth has reformed its original institutions, and turns out there have been a few pretty useful innovations in the last 200 years. And I think we need to move in a direction closer to majority rule. And that means a few things. It means, and it means constitutional reform. It means a limited filibuster first and foremost, but things like reforming the way the Senate is elected and ultimately eliminating the Electoral College. No other democracy has an Electoral College. Argentina copied our Constitution back in the 1850s. It practically plagiarized our Constitution, just translated into Spanish, adopted an Electoral College. They got rid of theirs in 1994. It's time to get rid of the Electoral College. Now, that's a big lift, right? That's a constitutional reform. But I think that Americans need to begin to mobilize to democratize our democracy. But I would begin, I don't think I've gotten to 3, but I really, honestly, 1, 2, and 3 ought to be about voting rights.
So Steve, would you agree then that campaign finance reform is just off the table? This is given the Supreme Court?
Yeah, but yes, frankly, practically from practical standpoint, yes. But I think it would be dangerous and destructive to stop talking about critical issues just because they're politically not feasible. This is why I think, as hard as it is to eliminate the Electoral College, we got to eliminate the Electoral College. It's gone from a useless, vestigial institution to an openly anti-democratic institution that could wreck our democracy. I mean, again, Trump could have lost by 4 percentage points in this last election and been reelected. Imagine what generation of college students or millennials, people who've grown up since 2000, how they would react to a 3rd election in their lifetime in which the winner of the popular vote is denied the presidency. How much legitimacy would our democracy hold? So this is a reform that is essential, and so we've got to start talking about it. And I think the same thing about campaign finance reform. It's true, the politics, the judicial politics are not there, but it's essential to getting to a place where we can call our system minimally democratic. And so we've got to talk about it. I'm a big fan of campaign finance.
And I see one last question I'd like you to think about. Andrew Kless, director of the Global Studies Program, asks, could the draft or mandatory public service help in breaking down geographic and political polarization?
I think so. Sorry, I'm responding to somebody in the chat. Yes, I mean, I think drafts come about because of war, obviously, and major war. We only use the draft in major wars. Major wars are obviously I'm not going to advocate for war, but they are probably the best way of rallying citizens together and finding common ground and common identity, which we lack right now. So I'm not sure if it's the draft or the war that causes the draft that does it, but there's no question that it has exactly the effect that you're suggesting. I think so. I think we've got to do, government, there's only so much government to do, obviously, but any government effort that brings together citizens from really different backgrounds, that throws them together on the same side as part of the same project, I think is valuable. The army does do that. It obviously doesn't bring very many college-educated kids in the army, but across the racial and religious divide, the army brings together people much better than universities do, much better than other institutions do. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not a panacea, but a national service program, I think, would be a step in the right direction.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve, for your time and all the thought you put into it. Thanks so much for your work on democracy. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Andrew, you want to?
No, just thank you everyone for sticking around, and thanks again for coming to our second Global Studies lecture. We'll have another one next fall.
All right, great.
Okay, great to see everybody. Take care. Have a good night.